The silver tray felt like a lead weight against Zuri Coleman's shoulder, a permanent dent in her posture that served as a constant reminder of her place in the world. She stood perfectly still near a shadow-drenched pillar, a silent observer watching Soul's shadow elite drift through the lounge as if she were made of glass. Above her, massive crystal installations hung from the ceiling, washing the room in a cold, diamond light that made the guests' Patek Philippe's flash like warning signals. Zuri adjusted the collar of her starched white waitress uniform. It was crisp and professional, but against the sea of bespoke handbox and Italian silk whispering around her, it felt like a costume of forced servitude. Every person in the Onyx and Ivy Club spoke the secret language of power, the subtle nod that sealed a billion-1 deal, the precise distance kept between rivals, the effortless arrogance of owning the very ground everyone else walked on. Zuri was fluent in none of it. To the inhabitants of this cathedral of shadows, she was a service ghost, essential to the atmosphere, yet non-existent to the eye. She recognized the faces from the grim headlines her brother read at their kitchen table, the shipping tycoon with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and the tech heiress whose cold beauty was as sharp as a razor. But her gaze kept drifting, drawn like a moth to a flame, toward the corner where the dangerous money gathered. This was where the men in tuxedos that fit like armor sat, conducting business in whispers that could topple governments. Zuri knew she shouldn't be looking. She should have been checking the appetizer trays or polishing glassware. Yet her eyes remained fixed on the velvet chairs near the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the neon sprawl of Seoul glittered behind the men like a kingdom they had already conquered. At the heart of that dark constellation sat Han Yiseong. Even a waitress from the outskirts knew that name, though it was only ever whispered in the safety of the kitchen. The media called him a venture capitalist or a logistics giant, polite euphemisms for the heartbeat of the Han clan. He was younger than the legends suggested, his jet-black hair slicked back with a precision that bordered on lethal. His face was a masterpiece of sharp cheekbones and olive skin, carved from stone, if the sculptor had been obsessed with the concept of absolute dominance. When Yiseong shifted in his velvet chair, the crowd moved instinctively. It was a silent ripple of bodies stepping back to give him air, a subconscious acknowledgement of the apex predator in the room. Men like him didn't inhabit the same reality as women like Zuri. She was there to survive the shift, collect her tips to pay for her brother's tuition, and disappear back into a cramped apartment where the heater barely worked. She forced her eyes toward the floor, repeating her mantra, focus on the tray. Stay in the shadows. Zuri, focus, her manager's voice hissed in her earpiece, sharp enough to draw blood. He appeared at her side, his eyes scanning the room for any imperfection. Table 4 needs a refill, and for heaven's sake, stop staring at the chairman. You want to keep your job or you want to disappear. Zuri clutched the tray tighter, the metal cold against her skin. She didn't want to be seen. She wanted to be a ghost. But as she turned toward table 4, she felt a weight on the back of her neck, a gaze so heavy and intense it felt like a physical touch. She looked back one last time, and for a heartbeat, the man in the velvet chair wasn't looking at the city or his business partners. Han Yiseong was looking directly at her, his dark eyes narrowed, as if he had finally spotted something real in a room full of illusions. Hello, family. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel. Now let's go back into the story. The air in the Onyx and Ivy Club was thick with the scent of overpoured cognac and the kind of perfume that cost more than a month of Zuri Coleman's rent. She moved through the Lunar Syndicate Gala, not as a person, but as a shadow, a silent, efficient extension of the mahogany walls and velvet drapes. Her starched white uniform was a badge of her non-existence. In this room, white cotton was the color of the help, and the help was never meant to be looked at. Every few minutes, Zuri shifted the silver tray to her left shoulder, trying to ignore the dull, throbbing ache radiating down her spine. To the elite drifting past her, she was a service ghost. She was the hand that replaced a smoldering cigar, the phantom that wiped a condensation ring off a marble table, and the statue that stood perfectly still while billions of one were traded in hushed, lethal whispers. Another round of the 1945 vintage, girl, and be quick about it. The command came from a young heir whose eyes never once rose to meet Zuri's. He spoke to her shoulder, his voice carrying the effortless arrogance of someone who had never known a day of hunger. Zuri bowed her head, the precise, 45-degree angle required by her manager, and retreated toward the bar. This was the cathedral of exclusion. Zuri recognized the players, the shipping magnates, the corrupt politicians, and the tech giants who treated the law like a suggestion. They lived in a world of clear light, while Zuri lived in the gray. She thought of Marcus, her younger brother, probably hunched over his textbooks in their cramped apartment where the radiator hissed but never quite produced heat. His tuition was the reason she endured the swollen ankles and the stinging insults disguised as orders. As she glided back toward the floor, she felt the temperature of the room seem to drop. The boisterous laughter of the younger heirs died down into a respectful, fearful hum. The focus of the room had shifted toward the eastern windows, where the dangerous money sat. These weren't just businessmen. These were the architects of the city's underworld. At the center of that dark constellation sat Han Yiseong. Zuri kept her gaze low, focusing on the polished tips of her black shoes. She knew the legends. Yiseong was the heartbeat of the Han clan, a man whose silence was more terrifying than most men's shouting. From the corner of her eye, she could see the silhouette of his tuxedo, perfectly tailored armor that housed a body built for violence. His tattooed hands, etched with the ink of the syndicate, rested calmly on the arms of his chair. She reached the edge of his circle to clear a discarded glass. She breathed shallowly, trying to remain part of the background, a ghost among the monsters. She had spent 2 years at Onyx and Ivy perfecting the art of being unnoticeable. She was a master of the shadow. But as she reached for the glass, the air around her suddenly felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. The hair on her arms stood up. She felt a gaze, not the dismissive glance of a spoiled heir, but a heavy, predatory weight that pinned her to the spot. Slowly, against every instinct that told her to run, Zuri lifted her head. Han Yiseong wasn't looking at the city. He wasn't looking at his lieutenants. His dark, unreadable eyes were locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. For the first time in her life, the invisible girl had been seen, and the look in the Mafia boss's eyes suggested that once he saw something he wanted, he never let it go. The shift turned from exhausting to agonizing the moment the balance of power in the room curdled. Zuri moved toward the center of the lounge, her boots silent on the plush carpet, her mind already calculating the hours left until she could shed this uniform. She didn't notice the sway of the drunk air until it was too late. He was a silver spoon, regular named Minho, a man whose family owned half the high-rises in Gangnam and whose blood was currently more whiskey than water. As Zuri glided past with a fresh tray of crystal tumblers, he stumbled, his heavy shoulder catching her off balance. The world slowed into a horrifying sequence of gravity and failure. The silver tray tilted. The glasses slid, a high-pitched screech of crystal against metal, before they shattered against the floor in a spray of glittering shards. The sound was like a gunshot in the refined hush of the gala. "You clumsy bitch," Minho roared, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at the girl who had dared to be in his way. Zuri dropped to her knees instinctively, her fingers frantic as she tried to gather the larger pieces of glass. "I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident." "An accident?" he sneered, stepping into her space, his expensive Italian loafers crunching on the shards. He looked around at his friends, seeking an audience for his cruelty. "You've ruined my shoes. Do you have any idea what these cost? More than your life is worth." "I'm sure." Zuri kept her head down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the heat of 100 judgmental eyes on her. To them, this wasn't a tragedy. It was entertainment. She was the service ghost who had finally malfunctioned. "Clean it," Minho commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "And then stay there. I need a footrest, and you seem perfectly suited for the job." A few people in the crowd chuckled, a light, tinkling sound that felt like ice water down Zuri's spine. She felt the first sting of a glass cut on her thumb, a bead of crimson blooming against the white of her apron. She was trapped in the cathedral of exclusion, and the high priest was demanding a sacrifice of her dignity. "I said, clean it," Minho repeated, raising his hand as if to strike her. But the blow never landed. The air in the room didn't just chill, it froze. A heavy, rhythmic footfall echoed across the marble, the sound of perfectly tailored armor in motion. The crowd parted like a sea of silk and satin, the laughter dying in throats as if choked out by an invisible hand. Han Yixiong didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply arrived. He stepped into the circle of light, his presence so massive it seemed to swallow the room's oxygen. He didn't look at Minho. He looked down at Zuri, who was still trembling on the floor, the blood from her thumbs staining her white cuff. "Stand up," Yixiong said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the vibration of a landslide. It was an order that brooked no hesitation. Zuri looked up, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. She saw the dragon tattoo on his neck pulse as he clenched his jaw. With a shaky breath, she stood, her simple waitress uniform stark and ruined amidst the shattered crystal. Minho's bravado evaporated instantly. "Chairman Han, she was in the way. She's just a waitress." Yixiong finally turned his gaze to the air. It was the look of a man deciding whether a bug was worth the effort of crushing. "She is in my way now," Yixiong remarked, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "And you are making a scene in my club." Before Zuri could process the movement, Yixiong's tattooed hand reached out. His fingers, etched with the ink of the Han clan, wrapped firmly around her waist. The contact was a shock of high-voltage heat. He didn't just touch her, he claimed her. In one fluid, dominant motion, he pulled Zuri toward the velvet chair he had just vacated. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a gale wind. "Everyone is looking for a show tonight," Yixiong announced to the room, his eyes scanning the elite with a look of pure, unadulterated possession. He sat down, and without breaking eye contact with the stunned Minho, he pulled Zuri Coleman, the invisible girl, the service ghost, the nobody from the outskirts, directly onto his lap. The "everyone froze" moment wasn't a metaphor. Champagne flutes remained suspended midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. The hierarchy of soul had just been set on fire. Zuri's body was rigid, her heart thundering so loud she was sure he could feel it against his chest. She was caught between fear and a sudden, inexplicable pull toward the man whose ink-stained hands now rested firmly on her thigh. "You're not leaving this spot tonight," Yixiong whispered near her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "From now on, the only person you serve is me." The sleek, armored silhouette of the black sedan looked like a predatory shark cruising through the shallow, murky waters of Zuri's neighborhood. Here, the neon lights of Gangnam were replaced by flickering fluorescent tubes and the smell of charcoal soot and cheap street food. The car slowed to a crawl, navigating narrow alleys where the brick walls were crumbling and the shadows felt thick enough to touch. Inside the car, the silence was heavy. Zuri stared out the window at the familiar cracked pavement, feeling a deep sense of vertigo. Less than an hour ago, she had been a service ghost on the floor of the most exclusive club in the country. Now, the man who had set the city on fire by pulling her onto his lap was sitting inches away from her in the back of a vehicle that cost more than her entire street. "Is this where you live?" Yixiong's voice was low, vibrating through the leather upholstery. He wasn't looking at the crumbling buildings with disgust. He was observing them with the cold, analytical eye of a man looking at a map. "It's not the plaza," Zuri replied, her voice sounding small even to her own ears. She clutched her ruined waitress apron in her lap, her fingers still stained with the copper tang of her own blood. The car stopped in front of a fourth-floor walk-up where the stairs groaned under the weight of even a child. Yixiong didn't wait for his driver. He opened the door and stepped out, his tailored tuxedo a jarring, violent contrast to the peeling paint and rusted handrails. He stood there for a moment, the apex predator of the underworld standing in a gutter, and for the first time, Zuri saw the sheer scale of the power he carried. He didn't just inhabit space, he dominated it. "Upstairs," he commanded. It wasn't a request. They climbed the stairs in silence, the only sound the rhythmic tap of his Italian leather shoes and the frantic thudding of Zuri's heart. When they reached her door, she hesitated, her hand trembling on the key. Inside was her life, small, clean, but desperately poor. Inside was Marcus, her only reason for breathing. Yixiong stepped inside without an invitation. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the stacks of textbooks on the small kitchen table and the radiator that was currently dead and cold. He walked over to the table and picked up a tuition notice for the Seoul Institute of Technology. It was stamped in red. Final notice. "Marcus," Zuri whispered, realizing Yixiong was reading her life story in the paperwork. He's brilliant. He's going to be an engineer. I just need to get him through this semester. Yixiong turned, the light from the single overhead bulb catching the sharp angles of his face. He looked like a masterpiece of cruelty and grace. He pulled a leather-bound checkbook from the inner pocket of his jacket, the movement slow and deliberate. You need 6,000,001 for the tuition, he stated, and another 4 for the back rent and the heater. Zuri's breath hitched. I can work extra shifts, I can. You can't, Yixiong interrupted, stepping into her personal space until she was backed against the cold kitchen counter. You're done at Onyx and Ivy. You became a liability the moment you sat on my lap. No manager in this city will touch you now, either because they fear me or they fear the people who want to kill me. He scribbled a number on the check, a number that didn't just pay the tuition, but wiped every debt she had ever known. He held it out, pinned between 2 tattooed fingers. The price of your soul is remarkably low, Zuri, he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers. I am offering you a new contract, 6 weeks. You will be my private interest. You will wear the silk I buy you, you will eat the food I provide, and you will stand by my side at every gala, every board meeting, and every syndicate summit. A shield, Zuri realized, her voice shaky. You want them to look at me instead of your business. I want them to think I have a weakness, Yixiong corrected, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. The Park family is pushing for a marriage alliance that would cage me. If they think I've lost my mind over a girl from the outskirts, they'll hesitate. They'll look for a way to use you against me, and while they are looking at you, I will be moving my pieces to destroy them. Zuri looked at the check. It was a lifeline. It was a way out for Marcus. But as she looked at Yixiong's ink-stained hands, she knew it was also a golden cage. Why me? She asked again, the question from the car still haunting her. Yixiong leaned in, his face inches from hers, his scent, sandalwood and expensive tobacco, enveloping her. Because everyone else in that room was a lie, Zuri. You were the only thing that was real. And in my world, the only thing more dangerous than a lie is the truth. He pressed the check into her hand, his thumb lingering over her palm, his touch like a branding iron. Tomorrow, a car will arrive at dawn. Pack your things. You don't live in the gray anymore. You belong to the Han clan. As he walked out, leaving the smell of power and danger in her small kitchen, Zuri looked at the check. She had saved her brother, but as the door clicked shut, she realized she had just stepped out of the shadows and directly into the heart of a war. The sunrise over Seoul was a bruised purple, a jagged line of light cutting through the smog as the black sedan pulled away from the curb. Zuri sat in the back. Her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of a single, battered suitcase. She didn't look back at the 4th-floor walk-up. She couldn't. If she saw Marcus waving from the window, she might jump out of the moving car. She had traded her presence for his future, a transaction signed in ink and sealed with the weight of Han Yixiong's gaze. As the car climbed the winding roads of Buckhanson, the city fell away, replaced by high stone walls and the dense, dark green of the mountain forest. This wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a fortress. When the iron gates of the Han compound groaned open, Zuri felt a cold shiver of finality. The Dragon's Lair was a sprawling estate of black slate and glass, a masterpiece of modern architecture that seemed to grow out of the jagged rock itself. It was beautiful, sterile, and terrifying. We've arrived, Miss Coleman, the driver said, his voice as neutral as the gray interior of the car. Zuri stepped out into the crisp mountain air, her breath hitching. Armed men in dark suits stood at every perimeter, their eyes scanning the forest with a vigilance that suggested they weren't just guards, they were soldiers. She felt smaller than she ever had at Onyx and Ivy. There, she was a ghost among the rich. Here, she was a rabbit in a wolf's den. The front doors swung open before she could reach for the handle. The interior was a cathedral of silence, floors of polished obsidian reflecting the high, vaulted ceilings. At the center of the great hall, framed by a massive window that overlooked the sprawling city below, stood Han Yixiong. He had traded his tuxedo for a charcoal silk robe, his posture relaxed but radiating a predatory stillness. As Zuri approached, her footsteps echoing too loudly on the obsidian, he turned. The morning light hit him at a sharp angle, revealing the details the dim club lighting had hidden. You're early, he remarked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the very floorboards. "I didn't think it was the kind of appointment I should be late for," Zuri replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Yixiong walked toward her, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped inches away, invading her personal space until the scent of sandalwood and old wood smoke enveloped her. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering near her face before his fingers hooked under her chin, tilting her head back. "You look tired," he murmured, his thumb brushing the dark circles beneath her eyes. "This world is heavy, Zuri. You'll need to learn how to carry it." As he moved, the collar of his silk robe shifted, slipping just enough to expose the base of his neck. Zuri's breath caught in her throat. There, etched into his skin in deep, dark ink, was the dragon. It wasn't just a tattoo, it was a masterpiece of violence. The dragon's tail coiled around his collarbone, its claws digging into his shoulder, and its head rested right over his carotid artery. As Yixiong spoke, the dragon seemed to come alive. With every pulse of his heavy heartbeat, the ink shifted, the dragon's neck expanding and contracting as if it were breathing. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic movement, the pulse of the Han clan's power visible on his very skin. Zuri stared at it, mesmerized and horrified, realizing that this man didn't just lead the syndicate, he was the syndicate. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a dangerous rumble. "The dragon," Zuri whispered, her eyes still locked on the pulsing ink. It looks like it's breathing." Yixiong's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, a flicker of something raw and possessive sparking in their depths. He leaned in closer, his lips hovering near her ear, his hand sliding from her chin to the back of her neck, his palm warm against her skin. "It breathes when I breathe," he said, his breath ghosting over her ear. "And it hungers when I hunger. Remember that, Zuri. In this house there are no scripts. There is only what I allow." He pulled back, his gaze sweeping over her with a terrifying intensity. "My housekeeper will show you to your quarters. You'll find a wardrobe waiting for you. The waitress is dead. Tonight, the city meets my new obsession." As he walked away, the dragon on his neck pulsing one last time before it disappeared beneath the silk, Zuri realized she hadn't just moved into a mansion. She had entered a cage where the bars were made of ink, and the lock was held by a man who didn't know how to let go. The transition from the waitress Zuri to the private interest of the Han clan began in a dressing room that felt more like a gallery of armor. The wardrobe waiting for her was a collection of silks so fine they felt like water, and gems that carried the cold weight of a mortgage. But as Zuri stood before the three-way mirror, draped in a gown the color of midnight, she still saw the girl from the fourth-floor walk-up. "You're overthinking the fabric," a voice rumbled from the doorway. Yixiong leaned against the frame, his presence cutting through the feminine softness of the room. He walked toward her, his reflection joining hers in the glass. He stood behind her, his large, tattooed hands coming to rest on her bare shoulders. The ink on his fingers stood out in sharp relief against her deep brown skin. "In this world, Zuri, wealth isn't about what you wear. It's about the space you occupy," he said, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "Tilt your chin up, 2 degrees. Never look like you're searching for approval. Look like you're waiting for them to prove they're worth your time." He began to move her like a chess piece, his touch clinical yet burning. He taught her the language of silence, the way to hold a crystal glass so the light hit the family crest, the way to walk into a room as if she owned the air people were breathing, and the exact pressure of a gaze that could wither a rival without a single word being spoken. "The elite are like predators," Yixiong whispered, his chest pressing against her back as he adjusted her posture. "They smell hesitation. They feast on those who look like they don't belong. You must be the only thing in the room that is unshakable." Zuri practiced the walk, the tilt, the cold stare. She mimicked the cathedral of exclusion she had watched for years from the sidelines. She became a perfect, silent sculpture of high society. But as the hours passed, the weight of the performance began to suffocate her. "Is this what you want?" Zuri asked suddenly, her voice cracking the polished silence of the room. She turned in his arms, her eyes flashing with a spark of the old Zuri. "A puppet who knows which fork to use and how to look down her nose at people. You're paying for a lie, Yixiong. But I'm not a lie. I'm the girl who had to scrub the floors of the club you own." Yixiong went still. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse, the ink shifting with the sudden tension in his frame. He looked down at her, his unreadable expression finally fracturing. "The elite speak in codes because they have nothing real to say," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly hum. He reached out not to adjust her dress but to cup her face, his thumb tracing the fullness of her lower lip. "I am surrounded by people who have mastered the language of wealth. They are boring. They are predictable." He leaned in closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I taught you those tricks so they won't hurt you, so they won't see the waitress and think you are easy prey. But don't ever mistake the performance for the person." He pulled back just enough to look into her expressive, wide eyes. "I didn't bring you here because you fit into this world. I brought you here because you don't. I prefer your honest tongue, Zuri. I prefer the way you look at me like you're ready to set my house on fire. The silk is for them. The fire, that is for me." For a moment, the gap between the Mafia boss and the waitress vanished. There was no dragon's lair, no syndicate, and no tuition debts. There was only the heat of his hands and the truth in his words. "Stay honest with me," Yixiang commanded, his grip tightening slightly. "Lie to the board, lie to the parks, but never lie to the man who holds the keys to your cage." As he turned to leave, Zuri realized the lesson wasn't about wealth at all. It was about survival. And in the dangerous world of Han Yixiang, the most lethal weapon wasn't a gun or a diamond. It was the truth spoken by someone who wasn't afraid to lose. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom was a sprawling landscape of white lilies and quiet money, but the silence shattered the moment the heavy doors opened. Zuri was no longer in her starched white uniform. She was draped in a gown of molten gold that clung to her deep brown skin like a second act of defiance. Beside her, Yixiang walked with the measured, lethal grace of a king, returning to a battlefield. Tonight was the Han clan's annual charity auction, a high-stakes game of ego where every bid was a declaration of war. As they approached the Han family's center table, the air in the room seemed to thin. Zuri instinctively slowed her pace, her muscle memory from years of service telling her to step back, to find her place in the shadows behind his chair. She reached for the back of his seat, preparing to stand as his silent, decorative accessory. But before she could settle into the role of a ghost, Yixiang's hand shot out. His tattooed fingers caught her wrist with a grip that was firm, warm, and utterly undeniable. "What are you doing, Zuri?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration that didn't carry past the circle of their immediate space. "I'm standing where I belong," she whispered, her eyes darting to the neighboring table, where the Park family sat watching them with predatory interest. "I'm the assistant, remember? I stay behind the line." Yixiang's dark eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp intensity. The dragon tattoo on his neck pulsed, the ink shifting against his collar as he tugged her forward. He didn't just move her, he dismantled her internal hierarchy. "The line moved the night I touched you," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. He didn't pull out the chair behind him. He kicked out the heavy, velvet-cushioned chair directly beside his own, the seat reserved for a wife or an equal partner. The elite guests froze, their champagne flutes suspended midair. To the Han board, this was a scandal. To the Park Syndicate, it was a declaration of a fatal weakness. "Sit," he commanded. Zuri felt the weight of 100 stares, some disgusted, some terrified, all shocked. She hesitated, the ghost of the waitress within her screaming that she was crossing a boundary that had no return. Yixiang leaned in, his scent of sandalwood and cold mountain air enveloping her. "You aren't here to serve them, Zuri. You're here to make them realize that I don't give a damn about their rules." When she finally sat, the silk of her dress rustling against the velvet, Yixiang didn't turn to the auctioneer. He leaned back, his posture radiating a terrifying ease, and placed his tattooed hand firmly on her thigh. It was a public branding, a display of public possession that told every shark in the room exactly where his priorities lay. The auction began, but no one was looking at the art. They were looking at the black woman from the outskirts sitting at the head of the underworld's table. "You're making them hate me," Zuri whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for her water glass. Yixiang didn't look away from the stage, but his grip on her leg tightened, a grounding pressure that demanded she stay present. "Let them hate you," he replied, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "It means they're afraid of you. And in this room, Zuri, fear is the only currency that doesn't devalue. As the bidding climbed into the millions, Zuri realized she wasn't just sitting at a table. She was sitting on a throne of glass, and Yixiong was the only thing keeping it from shattering beneath her. For the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a storm, and the man beside her was the lightning. The high of the auction was short-lived, replaced by the chilling reality of the war Zuri had inherited. 2 days later, a delivery arrived at the Han estate, not for Yixiong, but for her. It was a vintage mahogany box, smelling faintly of funeral lilies. Inside lay a single, starched white Waitress apron, identical to the one she had worn at Onyx and Ivy, but this one was shredded to ribbons and soaked in deep, synthetic crimson. Tucked into the ruined fabric was a card with a single sentence in elegant calligraphy. A ghost should stay in the shadows before it is laid to rest. Zuri was still staring at the box, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps, when the heavy doors of the study swung open. Yixiong walked in, the cold mountain air still clinging to his black overcoat. He took one look at her pale face and the box on the table, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Zuri," he said, his voice a low, warning vibration. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He didn't look at the box first. He looked at her, his hands coming up to cup her face, checking for physical harm with a frantic intensity he couldn't quite mask. When he finally turned his gaze to the shredded apron, the icy courtesy he maintained for the world vanished. The dragon on his neck didn't just pulse, it seemed to writhe. The ink darkened, the dragon's head straining against the pulse of his carotid artery as his jaw tightened to the point of snapping. "Chairman Park," Yixiong hissed, the name sounding like a curse. "He thinks he can play with what is mine." "Yixiong, I knew this was dangerous," Zuri whispered, her voice trembling. "But seeing this, it makes it real. They aren't going after your business, they're going after me." The transformation in him was instantaneous. The refined, calculated businessman disappeared, replaced by something ancient and predatory. He didn't pull away. Instead, he pulled her flush against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a feral possessiveness that was almost suffocating. One hand was buried in her hair, holding her head against his heartbeat, while the other rested on the small of her back, pinning her to him. "You are not a distraction anymore, Zuri," he growled into her hair, his voice vibrating with a raw, terrifying promise of violence. "You are the center of my world. If they touch a single hair on your head, I will not just start a war. I will burn the city until there is nothing left but ash and the memory of what they dared to take." He stepped back just enough to look her in the eyes, his own narrowed and burning with a dark, protective fire. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw, his tattooed thumb lingering over her skin as if marking her. "From this second on, you don't move without my shadow behind you. You don't eat, you don't sleep, you don't breathe unless I know you are safe," he commanded. The deal, the 6 weeks, the money, it all felt irrelevant now. He wasn't talking like a man who had hired a shield. He was talking like a man who had found his soul and was ready to kill anyone who looked at it the wrong way. "Let them send their messages," Yixiong whispered, his lips grazing her forehead. "They'll soon realize that the only thing more dangerous than the Han clan is the man who has something to lose." As he turned to bark orders to his security detail, Zuri saw the dragon on his neck pulsing with a new, violent rhythm. The game had changed. The coded threat had backfired, turning the cold Mafia boss into a feral protector who would stop at nothing to keep her in his light. The scent of salt and rotting would hung heavy over the Incheon docks, a stark, brutal contrast to the clinical luxury of the Han estate. Zuri sat in the center of an empty warehouse, her hands zip-tied to a rusted chair, the moonlight cutting through the jagged holes in the corrugated metal roof. She wasn't a service ghost anymore. She was a beacon for a war she hadn't started. Chairman Park emerged from the shadows, his face an old, wrinkled map of malice. He didn't look like a businessman tonight, he looked like a butcher. He gripped Zuri's chin with cold, skeletal fingers, forcing her to look at the dark water outside. "He's coming for you," Park rasped, a thin smile stretching his lips. "I've spent 30 years looking for Han Yixiong's price. I never thought it would be a waitress from the slums." "He won't come for a contract," Zuri spat, though her voice wavered. "Oh, child, this stopped being about a contract the moment he put you at his table," Park laughed. "He didn't hire a shield. He built a cage to keep his only treasure inside." The heavy steel doors of the warehouse suddenly groaned, the sound of metal screaming against metal. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Then came the footsteps, steady, rhythmic, and heavy. Yixiang stepped into the moonlight. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a silk robe. He wore a black tactical jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink crawling down his forearms. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury, but it was the dragon on his neck that caught the light. The ink seemed to glow, pulsing with a violent, jagged rhythm that matched his heavy breathing. "Let her go, Park," Yixiang said. The words weren't a request, they were a death sentence. "You're losing your edge, Yixiang," Park taunted, pulling a blade from his pocket and resting the cold steel against Zuri's throat. "All this for a girl? The board thinks you've gone soft. They think the $60,000 was a business expense, but we all know the truth." Zuri's heart froze. The $60,000. She whispered, looking at Yixiang. Yixiang didn't blink. He kept his eyes locked on Park, but his voice softened just a fraction when he spoke to her. "The contract was a lie, Zuri, from the very first night at the gala." As his men moved into the shadows to flank Park's guards, Yixiang took a step forward, ignoring the guns leveled at his chest. "I didn't need a fake girlfriend to stop a marriage. I'm the head of the Han clan. I do what I want. I made up the deal because I knew the Parks were already moving. I knew they'd target anyone I showed interest in." The realization hit Zuri like a physical blow. The fake arrangement, the 6-week timeline, the business-like check, it had all been a ruse to justify bringing her behind his walls. He hadn't bought her services, he had bought her safety. He had created a script because he knew she was too proud to accept his protection for free. "You used the contract to keep me close enough to guard," Zuri realized, her eyes stinging. "I used it because I didn't know how else to keep you without scaring you away," Yixiang admitted, his voice a low growl of raw honesty. "But the contract is over." In a blur of motion that defied the eye, Yixiang moved. A single shot rang out from his silencer, catching the hand that held the blade to Zuri's throat. As the warehouse erupted into chaos, the rhythmic thunder of gunfire and the shouts of men, Yixiang was a whirlwind of lethal precision. He didn't go for Park, he went for her. He reached the chair in seconds, his knife slicing through the zip ties with a single, desperate stroke. He didn't pull her to her feet. He pulled her into his arms, his body a shield against the world. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breathing ragged, the dragon on his skin pulsing frantically against her collarbone. "I've got you," he hissed, his grip so tight it was almost painful. "I've got you, no more scripts, no more lies." In the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of the Park Syndicate, Zuri finally understood. She wasn't a tool, and she wasn't a shield. She was the only thing that made the dragon of soul human. The aftermath of the docks felt like the world had been scrubbed clean by fire. The Park Syndicate was a memory, their influence dismantled in a single night of calculated fury. Back at the Han compound, the silence was no longer heavy with secrets. It was thick with a new, grounding reality. Zuri stood on the expansive terrace, the cold mountain air biting at her skin, though she barely felt it. She was wrapped in one of Yixiang's silk robes, the hem dragging on the obsidian floor. In her hand, she held the leather-bound checkbook and the physical contract he had drafted, the papers that defined her as a private interest for a 6-week term. The glass doors slid open behind her. Yixiang stepped onto the terrace, his silhouette cutting a sharp line against the sunrise. He didn't look like the untouchable chairman tonight. His tactical gear was gone, replaced by simple black clothes, and his face bore the shadows of a man who had nearly lost the only thing that mattered. He walked toward her, taking a silver lighter from his pocket. Without a word, he took the contract from her hand. He flicked the flame to life, the orange glow reflecting in the dark, unreadable depths of his eyes. He held the paper to the fire, watching as the legal jargon and the 6-week expiration date curled into blackened ash, scattering into the mountain wind. "The exit strategy is gone," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in Zuri's chest. Zuri looked at the ashes, then up at him. "What happens now, Yixiang? The 6 weeks aren't up. There's still money." "There is no money," he interrupted, stepping into her space until the dragon on his neck was inches from her face. The ink was still, the dragon finally at rest. The $60,000 was a lie to get you through the door. The fake deal was a bridge I built because I knew you. Never walk into a lion's den for free, but the bridge is burned. He reached out, his tattooed hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than his anger. His thumb traced the line of her lip, his touch possessive and permanent. I spent my life building a kingdom of shadows, he whispered, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. I thought power was about how many people feared me. I thought it was about the height of my walls. But standing in that warehouse, watching a blade at your throat, I realized I don't want the city. I don't want the board's approval. He pulled back just enough to lock his eyes onto hers, the intensity there enough to make her breath hitch. You are the only kingdom I want to own, Zuri, and I don't want you for 6 weeks. I want you until the dragon stops breathing. Zuri looked at the man who had pulled a service ghost onto his lap and changed the trajectory of her life. She realized she wasn't afraid of the cage anymore because the bars had never been made of iron. They were made of his need to keep her safe. No more scripts, she asked softly. No more scripts, he promised, his lips brushing hers in a seal of the only contract that mattered. Just us, and anyone who tries to come between us will find out why they call me a monster. Zuri wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers grazing the ink of the dragon. She had started the month as a waitress who felt like she didn't exist, and she was ending it as the heartbeat of the most powerful man in Seoul. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood a queen who finally had something worth fighting for.